Hello, this is Mrs. Lewis again with today's lesson on astronomy. Today we're going to talk about habitability, or how is the Earth like Goldilocks? You remember Goldilocks. She went to the three bears' house, and when she got there, she found some things that were just right for her. Just the right temperature porridge, just the right softness in her bed. The Earth has found things just right in the habitable zone around the sun. In the habitable zone, exactly where the Earth is, the temperature is just right. If it were too low, water would freeze, and if it were too high, the water would evaporate. Another thing is if it were too low, the chemical reactions on Earth would slow way down. If it were too high, the proteins and the DNA that living things are made up of would be denatured and they wouldn't work. But lucky for us, the temperature is just right, from minus 15 to 115 degrees. How do we keep this temperature just right? Well, the answer is the greenhouse effect. You might have heard of that with all the talk about global warming, and you might think the greenhouse effect is bad. Well, the greenhouse effect is very good. It's the greenhouse effect that keeps our temperature just right. The sun sends us energy in the form of ultraviolet light, and that ultraviolet light goes right through the atmosphere around the Earth. And it hits the solid Earth, where it gets changed into infrared radiation, and then it begins to move away. As it begins to move away, it hits the carbon dioxide of the greenhouse effect, and it bounces back to Earth. This keeps us warm. The carbon dioxide concentration for the greenhouse effect must be just right. If the concentration were too high, we'd be like Venus, too hot. The temperature of Venus reaches 475 degrees, boiling, very, very hot. If the carbon dioxide concentration were too low, we'd be too cold, like Mars. Mars goes from minus 125 degrees to 23 degrees. And the minus 125 would never work for us. The water concentration and state must be just right. We need liquid water. If we didn't have liquid water, we'd be like Mars. There's the surface of Mars. At one point, these were probably river valleys and there was water on Earth. But without water, there can be no life. All living organisms are somewhere around 75% water. If we had too much water, though, it probably wouldn't be a problem. If our Earth were covered with water, life as we know it would be very different, but it still would be possible. Another thing that has to be just right is the geological activity caused by the moving tectonic plates. This geological activity is going to recycle the elements in the Earth. And when we have subduction, we'll talk more about this in earth science, when we have subduction, the crust sinks, the oceanic crust sinks, and the elements are moved down into the earth. Then when we have volcanic activities, those elements are going to be moved up again to the surface of the earth. And we have to have this recycling at just the right level. One of the things that gets recycled is carbon. When we have carbon, we can talk about the carbon cycle. The carbon dioxide in the air is washed out of the air by rain, and then the rivers move the carbon into the ocean. When it gets to the ocean, it gets deposited on the ocean floor, and then it gets subducted so that it gets underneath the volcanoes. Then the volcanoes release the carbon as carbon dioxide into the air, and the cycle begins again. The rain washes it out of the air. The river moves it to the oceans. The oceans deposit the carbon, move it underneath the volcanoes, and the volcanoes release it as carbon dioxide. This cycle keeps the carbon renewing and keeps our temperature just right. Another thing that has to be just right about our planet is it has to be just the right size. If it were too small, like that, we wouldn't have enough gravity to hold our atmosphere. If it were too large, we'd be a giant gas planet, like the Jovian planets, like Jupiter. Another thing that has to be just right is the energy. We get our energy from the sun, and the sun's energy comes to us in ultraviolet radiation. If we had too much, that would be harmful. The ultraviolet radiation would be harmful to us. If we didn't have enough energy from the sun, there'd be no photosynthesis. No photosynthesis, no oxygen. Life as we know it could not exist. We have to have just the right magnetic field. The Earth has a magnetic field around us, and that protects us from the solar wind or the cosmic mass ejections. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't be protected. We need to have a moon. The moon is our climate regulator. The moon stabilizes the Earth's position at a slight tilt, and that tilt is what causes the seasons. During the summertime, the northern hemisphere, because of its tilt, is closer to the sun, but during the winter, it's further away. And that's how we get our seasons. If we didn't have our seasons and the Earth were just straight up and down, it would be way too cold on one side, way too hot on the other side. Another thing that we have is Jupiter. Jupiter is our protector. Jupiter is a very massive planet, and it has a lot of gravity, so it attracts the asteroids, and they don't come crashing to Earth. Without Jupiter, we'd be in great danger. Now, there's a big effort to look for other habitable planets in the sky. There are millions and millions of planets and stars out there. And there is a project called the Kepler Project, which has sent a telescope into space to look at space. Normally, when we look through a telescope, we see an amount of space about the size of a grain of sand. But the Kepler telescope looks at an amount of space about the size of your hand. So this Kepler's field of view is much larger. And what is Kepler looking for? Well, it's looking for evidence of planets. And this is what it looks for. Here's a planet, and here's a star. When the planet goes in front of the star, the light dims a little bit. And the Kepler telescope can detect this dimming and find planets. The Kepler project has found 461 new planet candidates. They're planet candidates because they're found in the habitable zone around their star. They could be Goldilocks planets just like us. So what do you think? Is there life on any one of these 461 planets? We'll be talking about that in class.